Departure concerning George Willard.
Young George Willard got out of bed at 4 in the morning. It was April, and the young tree leaves were just coming out of their buds. The trees along the residence streets in Winesburg are maple, and the seeds are winged. When the wind blows, they whirl crazily about, filling the air and making a carpet underfoot. George came downstairs into the hotel office carrying a brown leather bag. His trunk was packed for departure. Since 2 o'clock, he'd been awake thinking of the journey he was about to take and wondering what he would find at the end of his journey. The boy who slept in the hotel office lay on a cot by the door. His mouth was open and he snored lustily. George crept past the cot and went out into the silent, deserted main street. The east was pink with the dawn, and long streaks of light climbed into the sky where a few stars still shone. Beyond the last house on Trunnion Pike in Winesburg, there is a great stretch of open fields. The fields are owned by farmers who live in town and drive homeward at evening along Trunnion Pike in light, creaking wagons. In the fields are planted berries and small fruits. In the late afternoon, in the hot summers when the road and the fields are covered with dust, a smoky haze lies over the great flat basin of land. To look across it is like looking out across the sea. In the spring, when the land is green, the effect is somewhat different. The land becomes a wide green billiard table on which tiny human insects toil up and down. All through his boyhood and young manhood, George Willard had been in the habit of walking on Trunnion Pike. He had been in the midst of the great open place on winter nights when it was covered with snow and only the moon looked down at him. He had been there in the fall when bleak winds blew, and on summer evenings when the air vibrated with the song of insects. On the April morning, he wanted to go there again, to walk again in the silence. He did walk to where the road dipped down by a little stream 2 miles from town, and then turned and walked silently back again. When he got to Main Street, clerks were sweeping the sidewalks before the stores. "Hey, you, George, how does it feel to be going away?" they asked. The westbound train leaves Winesburg at 7:45 in the morning. Tom Little is conductor. His train runs from Cleveland to where it connects with a great trunk line railroad with terminals in Chicago and New York. Tom has what in railroad circles is called an easy run. Every evening he returns to his family. In the fall and spring he spends his Sundays fishing in Lake Erie. He's a round, red face and small blue eyes. He knows the people in the towns along his railroad better than a city man knows the people who live in his apartment building. George came down the little incline from the new Willard house at 7 o'clock. Tom Willard carried his bag. The son had become taller than the father. On the station platform, everyone shook the young man's hand. More than a dozen people waited about. Then they talked of their own affairs. Even Will Henderson, who was lazy and often slept until 9, had got out of bed. George was embarrassed. Gertrude Wilmot, a tall, thin woman of 50 who worked in the Winesburg post office, came along the station platform. She had never before paid any attention to George. Now she stopped and put out her hand. In 2 words, she voiced what everyone felt.
Good luck,
she said sharply, and then, turning, went on her way. When the train came into the station, George felt relieved. He scampered hurriedly aboard. Helen White came running along Main Street, hoping to have a parting word with him, but he'd found a seat and didn't see her. When the train started, Tom Little punched his ticket, grinned, and, although he knew George well and knew on what adventure he was just setting out, made no comment. Tom had seen 1,000 of George Willards go out of their towns to the city. It was a commonplace enough incident with him. In the smoking car, there was a man who had just invited Tom to go on a fishing trip to Sandusky Bay. He wanted to accept the invitation and talk over details. George glanced up and down the car to be sure no one was looking, then took out his pocketbook and counted his money. His mind was occupied with a desire not to appear green. Almost the last words his father had said to him concerned the matter of his behavior when he got to the city.
Be a sharp one. Keep your eyes on your money. Be awake, that's the ticket. Don't let anyone think you're a greenhorn.
After George counted his money, he looked out of the window and was surprised to see that the train was still in Winesburg. The young man, going out of his town to meet the adventure of life, began to think that he didn't think of anything very big or dramatic. Things like his mother's death, his departure from Winesburg, the uncertainty of his future life in the city, the serious and larger aspects of his life didn't come into his mind. He thought of little things. Turk Smollett, wheeling boards through the main street of his town in the morning. A tall woman, beautifully gowned, who had once stayed overnight at his father's hotel. Butch Wheeler, the lamplighter of Winesburg, hurrying through the streets on a summer evening and holding a torch in his hand. Helen White, standing by a window in the Winesburg post office and putting a stamp on an envelope. The young man's mind was carried away by his growing passion for dreams. One looking at him wouldn't have thought him particularly sharp. With the recollection of little things occupying his mind, he closed his eyes and leaned back in the car seat. He stayed that way for a long time, and when he aroused himself and again looked out of the car window, the town of Winesburg had disappeared, and his life there had become but a background on which to paint the dreams of his manhood.
Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to hear more great stories.